Catherine Doherty, foundress of Madonna House, first visited Edmonton in 1953 on her way to open a house in Whitehorse, Yukon Territory. During that time, she gave a lecture to a large audience. She met with Archbishop John MacDonald and learned some of the needs of the diocese. She also visited with Father Émile Brière, a young priest and professor at the seminary who was very involved with Catholic action groups, and was interested in having a Madonna House in Edmonton to serve the needs of transient men who were coming from all parts of Canada, looking for work, knocking at rectory and convent doors, asking for help. The following year, 1954, Archbishop MacDonald issued a formal invitation to Madonna House, and Catherine responded by appointing Dorothy Phillips to go to Edmonton to find a place and open a house there. Dot left Madonna House, Combermere, on January 7, 1955, with just $100 and a one-way train ticket to Edmonton, along with a blessing and much courage and faith. In Edmonton, she arrived at the Precious Blood Monastery, where the nuns offered a wonderful hospitality for her first few months. Dorothy spent a couple of months roaming the city streets, looking for a suitable house, and meeting with various groups seeking necessary help and support. Finally, Father Ketchen of Immaculate Conception Parish offered this old rectory, but it would have to be moved as they planned to rebuild. A lot was found for the house, but complications set in, and the city refused permission to move it, and it had to be torn down, so Dorothy looked and looked some more. This statue of St. Joseph was at the Precious Blood Convent, where Dot stayed. She put a note under it asking for a house and started a novena to St. Joseph. Soon a house was found, and on the feast of St. Joseph, an anonymous donation arrived just in time for Dot to make the down payment and avoid losing the house to another prospective buyer. This is it, the first Marian Centre. The house was a complete mess and needed extensive renovations. The sagging center of the house needed to be raised a few inches, the plumbing was bad, and the furnace was condemned. Dorothy rallied all who had promised support, and a host of volunteers pitched in. Work began tearing down walls and putting them elsewhere, rewiring, replacing pipes, plastering, painting, cleaning, installing appliances. With the kind and generous help of the people of Edmonton, the work was completed. The ground floor was divided into a kitchen and dining room. A clothing room was set up in a section of the basement. Two staff, Jim Murphy and Teresa Fazakerly, were sent to Edmonton to assist Dorothy in May. They sent a telegram announcing their arrival. On May 31st, the new Feast of the Queenship of Mary, we had our official opening reception and blessing. This picture shows Dorothy, Tess, Jim, and Father Brière, our first chaplain, under our newly painted Marian Centre sign. Father Brière was Marian Centre's first chaplain and a big support to Dorothy in those first months. He left in October to visit Combermere and ended up staying there. Our first chapel was upstairs, along with staff living quarters. Dorothy, Tess, and Jim posed with our first panel delivery truck, a 1935 Ford. It was donated by a seminarian whose family had abandoned it in a field, and the seminarians fixed it up for us. There are many stories about it, driving down the main street and having it stall and not able to move during rush hour traffic. Going out on a picnic and never getting there because the truck just stopped dead, or getting there and then trying to get home. It finally breathed its last sometime in August. Its replacement, a 1949 model, gave us problems as well. Kay O'Haron visited from Mary House in the Yukon on her holidays in July and made a cross to put above our Marian Centre sign. Here it is in place. The number of men coming for meals quickly grew. Stew was prepared from whatever was donated. This salmon trout made a delicious fish stew. A third staff worker, Marité Langlois, arrived in September. Catherine Doherty made her first visit to Marian Centre in the fall of 1955. She spoke at the Paramount Theatre to a near-capacity crowd. Almost from the very beginning, Dorothy realized that the house would not be big enough for the needs. The dining room could only seat 30 people at a time, and it wasn't long before we were serving over 100. Dot wanted to buy the adjoining empty lot from the city, which would allow us to build as needed. However, this was not possible as the city wanted the land for possible expansion of their engineering yard. In the end, the city offered a trade, the 95th Street house for a house on 98th Street, which had an adjoining empty lot, which we could have for an additional fee. There was also the option to buy a second house at the same location, which we purchased shortly afterward. Between the two houses across the alley in the back was an elementary school. The work of cleaning and remodeling another house started all over again. In December, we were once again busy with scrubbing, painting, plumbing, carpentry, making curtains, packing, and setting up a kitchen and dining room to serve meals. When everything was ready, we moved into this, the second Marian Centre, in the midst of a blizzard on December 12, 1955, the feast of Our Lady of Guadalupe. The house was set up with a kitchen and dining room on the main floor, and official opening day was December 24th. Upstairs was the chapel and staff living quarters. Our chaplain, Father Lucien Robert, blessed the house and new chapel on December 15th. In January 1956, we obtained the second house and named it St. Joseph's. More cleaning and redoing. The first floor became the clothing center. The second floor was the living quarters for the men's staff and chaplain. In February 1956, we got a brand new Volkswagen panel truck, blue with white trim. It was a joy to finally have a vehicle that worked and started in all kinds of weather. It was busy every day making food pickups for meals we served. By the spring of 1956, the need to expand was clear, but in order to build, we had to have permission from the city. That sounds simple, but oh, the red tape. Trouble and perseverance it took. Our application to build was refused, and the appeal board turned us down as well. A neighborhood petition circulated protesting our presence. Friends rallied to support us, and finally, in August, at a heated meeting, the City Council voted to overrule the appeal board and issue a building permit. In December 1956, Marian Centre became a receiving center for food, clothing, and household items for Hungarian refugees arriving nearby at Immigration Hall. From the early days of Marian Centre, Edmonton, Archbishop John H. MacDonald was interested in having Madonna House take over the running of the newly established Catholic Information Center. In February 1957, Mary Tay took over her new assignment there. Then, in May 1958, Thurston Smith came to replace her and remained in charge of the center for 9 years. By the spring of 1957, we were finally able to begin our long-awaited building. Our back porch had been used for food storage, and since it had been taken down, we moved a garage to the middle lot between our two houses in order to have a place for vegetable storage and prep during construction. Our Lady of the Smile greets visitors inside entryway. On Sunday, December 8th, 1957, we held an opening day tea with over 2,000 visitors coming in the course of the afternoon. Businessmen and local dignitaries came to pour tea. Bishop Anthony Jordan blessed the building. The mural of Christ in the breadline was unveiled and blessed. It was a copy of the wood engraving done by Fritz Eichenberg for the Catholic Worker. This is Bérengère Mercier, the Edmonton artist who painted our copy of Christ in the Breadline. New building shown between our two houses. Here are the men in the dining room. The new dining room had 12 large tables with a seating capacity for about 90 men at a time. Volunteers have always been a vital part of our life. The Catholic Women's League were active from the beginning, organizing to form a solid core of volunteer help, each group supplying workers on a regular basis. Many young people's group have come to help as well. For the first few years, all our dishes were washed by hand. In 1959, we finally got a dishwasher. Upstairs above the kitchen was our new chapel. Also upstairs was the office, library, and women's staff dorms. An advisory board was initially formed by Father Briere, who had many friends in the business community. They were of great assistance in making contacts for repairs, legal and insurance advice, and later with building and fundraising. The Knights of Columbus and Canadian Legion present a check to DOT from their fundraising. Many fundraisers were held by various groups to help finance construction, ranging from youth movie nights and car washes, bake sales and teas, to $25 a plate dinners and 10-car bingos. A yearly tea was put on by the Men's Advisory Board and the CWL from 1957 to 1972. After the new wing was built, the old Madonna House building was renamed St. John's and rearranged into storage on the first floor and the men's staff living quarters on the second floor. St. Joe's was reorganized into a more adequate clothing room. Since the men's staff moved to St. John's, the upstairs could now be used for storage of out-of-season clothing, and the main floor for the clothing room itself. This helped for a while. But by 1961, it was time to replace St. Joseph's House. The number of people using the clothing room had greatly increased, both the men and many women coming for clothing not simply for themselves, but mostly for their children. But the place was a fire trap. The floors buckled, and the space for sorting and distribution was extremely cramped and inadequate. Moving day from St. Joseph's clothing room to temporary storage. St. Joseph's is torn down. Going, gone. The sculpture of Our Lady of Combermere was created in copper by artist Heinrich Eichner, a recent German immigrant. Archbishop MacDonald blessed the new addition and sculpture in September of 1961. Inside was ample space for receiving, sorting, storage, and distributing clothing. The year of our 9th anniversary was also the year that our third and final wing was built. In order to have room for this, we acquired the small house north of St. John's and renamed it St. Francis during the short period we had use of it. St. John's is torn down, and St. Francis as well. The last phase of Marian Centre construction began in the spring of 1964. The plans called for the basement to include a large recreation room, offices, and meeting rooms. The upstairs would be a large chapel, office, handicraft room, and mission shop. Inside, the altar and tabernacle shelf are built. We received this statue of Our Lady of Combermere from the artist Francis Rich in February of 1964, and it was installed in our staff chapel of the first wing until the new chapel wing was ready. In November, she was moved to her home in front of the new chapel, dedicated to Our Lady of Combermere. The bishop came and consecrated the altar in November. Then a few weeks later, he came in December for our official opening and blessed the chapel. Our new tabernacle arrived in March 1965. In April, Joe Donahue, architect for the chapel, brought a prominent artist, Jordi Bonet, to see our chapel. When Mr. Bonet saw the empty wall at the side of the chapel, he said we should have the Stations of the Cross there. Dot said that we didn't have any money. A month later, we received a lovely letter from Mr. Bonet offering to donate a set of stations done in ceramic. Finally, they arrived and were installed in December. Downstairs, below the chapel, was a recreation room. Now, instead of having to wait in line in the cold until the doors opened for a meal, the men could come inside. There was a TV set, cards, checkers, chess games available, a piano, a magazine rack, and a reading room. A few years later, it was spruced up with curtains and a bright paint job. Jim Guinan started a discussion group among the men, which led to the beginning of the City Center Co-op Club in March 1965, with the primary aim of finding jobs. For several years, the Co-op Club built a float for the Klondike Days Parade, with their motto, "Let the men who help themselves help you." In 1965, Dorothy Phillips was named Citizen of the Year by the Junior Chamber of Commerce. The formal announcement and presentation was made by the JCs during Klondike Days in July. Then in September, our advisory board sponsored a reception and tea at Marian Centre to celebrate this honor. Another honor was bestowed on Dorothy in March 1990, when a street was named after her in West Edmonton, Phillips Row. Here she visits the site of the new development. A few years later, staff visit the site and point out the sign. Dorothy returned to Combermere in 1967. Mary McNamara and Jim Guinan followed her as directors. Jim and Mary worked tirelessly to raise awareness of needed social services, meeting with various groups seeking change. One such initiative was the overnight shelter. In October of 1968, Mary and Jim were part of a small group that met to talk about the problem of drinking men who were refused shelter at the men's hostel and old hotels. With nowhere to spend the night, they faced danger of death from exposure. The group formed the Overnight Shelter Society, rented a storefront, begged some old church pews, and opened the first shelter in February 1969. It provided bottom-line emergency shelter, with men sleeping on the floor or benches. Over the years, this evolved into the present George Spady Center, with added rehab and referral services. In the 1970s, Pustinia rooms were made available for days of solitude, prayer, and fasting. The library provided good spiritual reading. The handicraft area was busy in the 1970s when regular craft classes were offered with volunteer teachers. At that time, our gift shop area was expanded and redone. All the merchandise was donated, and all proceeds used for the poor in the Third World. The shop closed in 1994. In 1977, Michael Fagan became the director. In 1980, Michael was instrumental in organizing workshops and meetings regarding the possibility of starting a food bank in Edmonton, and one was established the following year. Various Edmonton priests served as chaplain in the early years. Then in 1968, Father Tom Zoller became the first Madonna House priest to serve as chaplain. Other Madonna House priests followed. Father Peter Nearing died while assigned to Marian Centre, where he was the chaplain from 1978 to 1987. In 1980, we celebrated our 25th anniversary. Here, former directors Jim Guinan and Mary McNamara joined the current directors, Mike Fagan and Carolyn Desch, for the special occasion. When Mike left, Mark Schlingerman and Carolyn Desch became co-directors. These directors followed. When we moved to 98th Street in 1955, it was primarily a residential area zoned for residential and light industrial use. There were about 20 single-family homes on the block, in addition to our two houses. At the northwest end of the block was a hall and rooming house. At the southeast corner, two warehouses. Behind Marian Centre was an elementary school. Later, this changed dramatically. The school was torn down in 1965 and replaced by school maintenance shops. Houses disappeared throughout the 80s and 90s as a commercial Chinatown grew up in the area with a proliferation of mini-malls. In 1982, West Macaulay Park was built across the street from us and then demolished in 1998. In 2015, the neighborhood is again in the midst of change, with construction cranes all over. The EPCOR Tower was completed in 2011. Now the new Royal Alberta Museum and hockey arena are being built near us. Proposed developments include a twin high-rise condo just across the street and the University of Alberta Galleria project directly adjacent to us. Our courtyard garden provides a place of rest and refreshment. The first Marian Centre is now a designated municipal historic resource called Paskin House, noted for its Queen Anne style. It has been renovated and an addition built, moved to the north end of the block, and is now the home of the Works Visual Arts Society. In conclusion, we thank you, our friends, volunteers, and benefactors, for your wonderful support and friendship over the years. Without you, our presence and work would not have been possible. Whatever you did for one of the least of these, you did for me.